just feel like my breath has been taken. I just keep hearing say, I'm gonna be 14. I'm gonna be 14 years old.
This is 13-year-old Malachi Lukes, a Washington, D.C. teenager who was shot and killed after appearing on camera in a rap video tied to an ongoing neighborhood feud. On the afternoon of March 1st, 2020, Malachi was walking with friends near S Street Northwest, Washington, D.C., when a car slowed behind them. Seconds later, gunfire erupted. Malachi ran, but he was struck in the back and collapsed in the street, dying from his injuries in broad daylight. Not long before that tragedy, Malachi had been briefly visible in music videos connected to local rappers, a presence that seemed harmless at the time. But in a city where rap had become an extension of street warfare, that visibility was later twisted into something far more dangerous. What Malachi never knew was that adults were already watching, already assigning meaning to his face, and already planning retaliation for a feud he had no part in. To understand how a child ended up targeted in a rap war he didn't choose, we have to go back to the very beginning. This is the life and death of Malachi Lukes.
Gotta run up your money. I'm in the trap with my brother. Young Pay Nick came through with 100. Go to Mexico to block and flood.
Malachi Lukes was born on March 5, 2006 in Washington, D.C., growing up in a city that shaped nearly every part of his short life. Malachi was raised in a close-knit family that did everything it could to shield him from the dangers that had long existed in parts of Northwest D.C. Those closest to him described him as respectful, curious, and energetic, the kind of kid who asked questions about the world and assumed there would always be time to figure things out later. At home, Malachi was surrounded by family members who tried to keep him grounded. He was not known as a troublemaker, and there was no public record suggesting he was involved in criminal activity.
Well, I've known him since he was about 5. He is one of the brightest little boys.
Like many kids his age, he spent time online, watched music videos, and admired older figures he saw gaining attention and status. But to his family, he was still a child who needed guidance, structure, and protection. And for a long time, they believed that protection was enough. But just beyond the walls of his home, the environment was changing, and those changes were subtle enough to go unnoticed at first. Malachi was a student who took school seriously. He spent years attending Washington Global Public Charter School, where teachers described him as bright and capable, with a future that had not yet been written. He later transferred to Cardozo Education Campus, a transition that was not unusual for students in the district. But school was only one part of Malachi's world. Outside of class, Malachi existed in a city where music carried the weight far beyond entertainment. Rap culture in Washington, D.C. was everywhere, blasting from cars, shared through phones, and passed around social media feeds. For kids growing up in Northwest D.C., local rappers were not distant celebrities. They were familiar faces, older neighborhood figures who represented success, respect, and survival in an environment where those things often felt out of reach. Malachi was drawn to that world in the way many young teenagers are. He appeared in music videos connected to local rappers not as a performer with his own platform, but as a background presence, someone standing nearby, someone visible but not central. But presence in this case would later be twisted into meaning it was never meant to have. What Malachi could not have understood at 13 was that the rap scene he brushed against was already entangled in a much older and more dangerous conflict. Neighborhood rivalries in Northwest D.C. had existed for years, rooted in territory, identity, and long-standing grievances. Over time, those rivalries found a new outlet through music. Diss tracks replaced confrontations, lyrics became coded messages, and audiences, both local and online, watched closely, amplifying everything. But even then, Malachi remained on the outside of that conflict, unaware of how closely music and violence had begun to mirror each other. That fragile separation started to collapse after the death of a young rapper named Talio Bird, known in the rap scene as Slack Goon. Slack Goon was 19 years old when he was killed on September 29, 2019. He'd built a reputation in the Northwest DC rap scene, particularly around the 3500 block, where he was closely associated with a growing group of artists and supporters. His music referenced neighborhood pride and rivalry, and his name carried weight in local circles. When he was shot and killed in broad daylight near S Street Northwest, the loss sent shockwaves through the community. The legal outcome of Slack Goon's death only deepened those wounds. The man who killed him, Adrian Vincent, also known as High Class 23, was eventually acquitted on the grounds of self-defense. In court, the shooting was ruled legally justified. On paper, the case was closed, but emotionally, it was anything but. Slack Goon's death became a symbol. In music, in conversations, and on social media, his killing was referenced again and again. Songs were released that hinted at revenge, anger, and unfinished business. The feud between the 3500 block and 9th Street intensified, not through direct statements, but through tone, imagery, and implication. And quietly, the environment around Malachi was becoming more dangerous. As months passed, the conflict escalated. Lyrics grew sharper, videos grew more explicit, and retaliation was no longer just something hinted at, it was being planned. Prosecutors would later argue that groups affiliated with the 3500 block began coordinating responses to Slack Goon's death, sharing weapons and targeting rival areas. The violence that followed was not random, it was intentional. But Malachi was still not the target. At least, not consciously. 5 months after Slack Goon's death, a string of shootings began across Northwest DC. Between February 22nd and March 1st, multiple incidents unfolded in rapid succession. In Petworth, 2 people were shot after a verbal exchange. Days later, gunfire erupted in 9th Street territory, injuring 3 alleged rivals and an innocent bystander sitting in her car. The message was clear. This was retaliation. And yet, even as the violence escalated, Malachi remained what he had always been, a child going about his day. Malachi's connection to the conflict did not come from words, threats, or street involvement. It came from visibility. In the months leading up to the devastating violence, Malachi appeared briefly in music videos tied to the ongoing rivalry between Northwest DC neighborhoods, unaware that the camera could carry consequences. At the time, no one treated it as dangerous, but in a city where music had become an extension of street politics, even brief appearances were being watched. Videos were replayed, screenshots were saved, and faces were remembered. What looked harmless to Malachi became something else entirely to people already looking for targets. And once that line was crossed, there was no way to undo it. Because from that moment on, Malachi was no longer just a child in the frame, he was being pulled into a feud he never chose. And everything changed on March 1st, 2020. Just after 2 p.m., Malachi was walking with friends near the 600 block of S Street northwest of Washington, D.C. It was daylight, the streets were active, there was nothing about the moment that suggested danger. But nearby, a stolen Kia Soul was moving through the area carrying men who were part of the retaliatory group. The car followed Malachi and his friends. When it stopped, 2 men got out. What happened next unfolded in seconds. Gunfire erupted. Malachi ran. He was shot in the back as he tried to escape. The bullet traveled through his heart and lung, causing him to collapse in the street. Another child was wounded. Doorbell cameras captured the sound of shots and screams, freezing the moment in time for anyone who later pressed play. Malachi Lukes died there, in the same neighborhood where he had gone to school, laughed with friends, and believed he was safe. But the violence did not end there. Just 10 minutes later, the same group allegedly carried out another shooting in a different neighborhood. No one was injured in that incident, but by then, the line between retaliation and recklessness had already been crossed. A child was dead, and the violence that had been simmering beneath the surface was now fully exposed.
What would have been a child's 14th birthday, his family is memorializing him instead. Malachi Lukes was gunned down over the weekend, becoming the latest victim of gun violence in the district tonight.
What happened next would shift the case from street rumors to documented fact. Later that same day, investigators began moving through Northwest DC with urgency. Officers canvassed blocks where shots had been reported, collecting shell casings and marking their locations. Surveillance cameras from nearby homes and businesses were pulled. Footage from alleyways, sidewalks, and intersections was reviewed frame by frame. At the same time, detectives began tracing phone records and social media activity, looking for patterns that connected what appeared to be isolated shootings into a single coordinated sequence. And as the evidence came together, a clearer picture started to emerge. By the end of that day, police had identified 4 men: Aaron Brown, Reginald Steele, also known as Gordo, Karan Jackson, and Tyone Freeman as suspects in the shooting that killed Malachi Lukes. All 4 were taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder while armed, along with multiple additional charges tied to a string of retaliatory shootings that unfolded over several days. Each of them was an adult. Each of them had years of life experience behind them, and each of them made decisions that placed a 13-year-old at the center of a conflict he had no role in creating. But the arrests were only the beginning. In the months and years that followed, the case expanded beyond a single shooting. Prosecutors laid out a broader conspiracy, arguing that Malachi's death was part of a calculated response to earlier violence tied to an ongoing neighborhood feud. Ballistics reports linked firearms to multiple crime scenes. Phone data placed defendants together before and after shootings. And perhaps most controversially, music videos and lyrics were pulled into evidence, not as art, but as documentation of motive and intent. It was only then that the full weight of the case became apparent. As pre-trial proceedings stretched on, 2 of the defendants chose to accept plea agreements. In 2024, Tyone Freeman and Karan Jackson each pleaded guilty to their roles in the shooting spree. Freeman was later sentenced to 108 years in prison, while Jackson received a 164-year sentence, reflecting the number of incidents prosecutors tied to the conspiracy and the severity of the harm caused. But the case was far from over. Attention soon shifted to Reginald Steele, whose trial prosecutors described as pivotal. Jury selection began on October 1, 2025, marking the start of a proceeding that would stretch across several months. Inside the courtroom, jurors were presented with a timeline that linked Slack Goon's death, the escalation of the feud, and the shootings that followed. They watched surveillance footage, they listened to recorded calls, and they were shown music videos that had once circulated online, now stripped of bravado and replayed as evidence. And it was during this phase that a disturbing pattern became impossible to ignore. Malachi's brief appearances in music videos were repeatedly referenced, not because he had done anything wrong, but because his image had been used to frame a narrative of rivalry and disrespect after his death. Prosecutors argued that his presence was retroactively weaponized, folded into a storyline that justified violence long after the camera stopped rolling. The trial concluded just before the end of the year. On November 24, 2025, the jury returned its verdict. Steele was found guilty of first-degree premeditated murder while armed, along with multiple counts of assault with intent to kill, weapons violations, and conspiracy charges tied to the broader shooting spree. But even with verdicts reached and sentences imposed, the legal process could only answer one part of the story. It could explain who was responsible, it could outline how the violence unfolded, it could even assign punishment. What it could not do was explain how a 13-year-old ended up caught in the middle of a war built on ego, music, and retaliation. And it was only after the arrests, trials, and verdicts were complete that the city began to fully confront what Malachi Lukes' death had taken from his family, his school, and his community. an understanding that would reshape how his story was remembered. But just when it seemed like the case could be neatly contained within court transcripts and sentencing orders, another truth surfaced, one that shifted the focus away from defendants and back to the child at the center of it all. Because before Malachi became a name in an indictment, before his image was replayed in courtrooms, he was simply a kid, and understanding who he was before that day would change how everything that followed was seen. Malachi Lukes was laid at rest on Friday, March 13, 2020. That morning, family members, friends, classmates, and community leaders gathered at Lincoln Temple United Church of Christ, located at 1701 11th Street, NW in Washington, D.C. The church filled early, not because of publicity or headlines, but because people understood what had been lost. A 13-year-old child, a student, a son, a life that had barely begun. Inside the sanctuary, grief moved quietly but heavily. There were tears, long pauses, and stories shared by those who knew Malachi beyond the headlines. Family members remembered his smile, his humor, and the ordinary moments that now felt painfully distant.
I just feel like my breath has been taken.
In an Only on 4 interview, Melissa Laws speaks
I'm lost at words, honestly.
about the loss of her son, Malachi Lukes. He turned 14 today. Instead of celebrating that birthday, they're mourning.
I just keep hearing say, I'm gonna be 14. I'm gonna be 14 years old.
Those are the last words she remembers before he was murdered Sunday afternoon.
You're gonna miss most about your son.
His smile. His smile.
He was shot and killed in the Shaw neighborhood. Police say a group of teens were involved in a dispute near S Street and someone opened fire.
It is not anything that I would wish for my worst enemy.
Tonight, Malachi's family and friends pay tribute to him at Lincoln Temple United Church.
My gosh, look how many lives Malachi has touched.
People like Serena Wiltshire, who wears a t-shirt honoring Malachi.
Well, I've known him since he was about 5 years old.
She taught him art at the Shaw Community Center.
He is one of the brightest little boys.
A smart young man with a promising future. His mother has a message for the killer.
For many in attendance, this was not just a funeral, it was a reckoning with how close violence had come to places once considered safe. Now, as sentences were handed down and convictions finalized, the justice system delivered accountability, but it could not deliver restoration. No ruling could give Malachi's family their child back. No prison term could erase the fear that settled into the community after his death. And no verdict could undo the way music, rivalry, and reputation had blurred into something deadly. Still, Malachi's case forced difficult conversations across Washington, D.C. Parents questioned how children were being pulled into adult conflicts. Schools reevaluated how they supported students living near persistent violence. Community leaders called for intervention earlier, before online posturing turned into real-world consequences. And prosecutors made it clear that music and social media would no longer be dismissed when they intersected with criminal behavior. But perhaps the most lasting impact came from a quieter realization. This was not a story about rap alone. It was not a story about neighborhoods alone. It was a story about how unchecked cycles of retaliation leave no room for innocence. Malachi Lukes should have been worrying about school assignments, friendships, and growing up. Instead, his life became a symbol of what happens when violence is normalized and children are treated as extensions of adult disputes. What do you think about it? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you found this story intriguing, please like, share, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.